Good morning, Derbycon. Is everyone as excited to be here as, well, everyone? Welcome to my talk. I'm Sean Metcalf, and welcome to the Reflection Talk. I've met some amazing people at Derbycon. I hope you have as well. Literally 3 a.m. this morning. Okay, so let's get started. Sorry, I had to do that. Had to reflect on what Derbycon has been for me. One of my favorite Derbycon memories was being on a stage much like this. So many people wanted to be here for a talk. Dave started lining people up front on the floor. And it felt very much like story time. One of my first ever con talks was here at Derbycon. Derbycon 2015, Derbycon 5. And I have spoken every year that I've been at Derbycon. I am very blessed to have been able to do that. And I thank you all for being here to support me for that. So I'm Sean Metcalf. Back to the normal format of this talk. I'm the founder of Trimark. We help organizations better secure their Microsoft platform on-prem and in the cloud. Microsoft Certified Master in Active Directory. Back to being an MVP. Spoken at a number of conferences. Like I said, I love Derbycon. I love the feel of Derbycon. I love the people. I love hanging out with people at Derbycon. That's why I lobbycon as much as possible. So we're going to talk about the top 15 most common AD security issues that we see at Trimark when we do AD security assessments. We're going to talk about how to detect Active Directory recon as well as how to break it and how to ultimately secure and harden a number of critical components of Active Directory, and then some wrap-up of recommendations. Can Active Directory be secured? I hear this a lot. Absolutely. One of Active Directory's greatest strengths is also one of its greatest weaknesses. The fact that Active Directory is one of the best products that Microsoft has ever developed means that oftentimes there are very few people to actually manage it because it just kind of works. Unlike a lot of other products which need typical care and feeding over time, AD, you just kind of throw a bunch of DCs at it and it just works. So let's talk about my top 15 most common AD security issues. There's a lot of different avenues to compromise an Active Directory, which makes it challenging, which makes it difficult for a lot of people because the people that are managing and administering Active Directory often are the ones that would need to lock it down or protect it. But they're busy fighting fires. They're busy keeping things up and working. And many, many times people don't know what they don't know. Because ultimately, in most environments, it's not just about domain admins. There are a lot of other groups that have rights. Most environments will have a workstation admins group, have a server admins group, and those groups are delegated and have access to everything. And we've seen where there's weak password policies. 10 characters. Well, that's better than the AD default of 7, but not by a whole lot. We've seen environments where actually there's a root domain in the forest, and then the child domain where all the users are, but all the admins are in the root domain, and the password policy for the root domain is 6 or 7 characters, and in the child domain it's 8. So we definitely want to make sure that our password policy makes sense. I feel like if you make the password policy require longer passwords, we can actually configure the policy so the users can have their passwords longer. And things like Azure AD Password Protection, which is a password filter on the DCs, which can prevent users from actually using bad passwords like, I don't know, password. There's also a couple ways that you can do some auditing of this. Mike Graffender, and I know that I'm saying his name wrong, and I apologize, Michael, but he wrote a tool you can check out on dsinternals.com, which is a PowerShell tool. And he also wrote a tool for Thycotic, which is based off of the same sort of information, where you can audit your passwords. And it checks against some common word lists and some other potential issues with those passwords. This is a big one. Often, stand up AD, it builds out these default policies, and you go about your business. Do what you need to do. And these policies don't change. Well, kind of they do. Sometimes a product that gets installed will change these policies on you. Or someone like Bob changed them 15 years ago, and Bob hasn't been around for like 12 years. No one's seen him, but that's okay. I'm sure Bob's all right. Reminds me of a comedian who told a joke, and he said, you ever go in a restaurant, and you're sitting there, and you're waiting, you put your name on the list, you're listening to everyone, and they're like, Johnson, party of 4. Johnson, party of 4. And no one gets up, right? He's like, what happened to the Johnson party of 4? Where are they? Does nobody care where they are? Wow, it is morning. It's got to be Sunday morning of Derbycon. This is another big issue. Domain controllers with minimal event auditing, configured with the standard auditing alerts or events. And oftentimes the SIM vendors have put these out back in, say, 2015, 2017, 2010, 2009, 2008, 2011. And the advice or the documentation from the SIM vendor when you spun up your SIM may not include the more advanced or the newer advanced auditing policies and events that you get with that. Or you've added them and you didn't set this setting, which means that, well, your domain controllers may actually just be auditing these standard events. So there's a command at the bottom of this slide, audit poll, which allow you to pull and get your complete auditing config. Account operators is from NT4. It should not be used anymore. Do not use that for delegation. Please remove it. It effectively has backdoor access to a lot of objects in the environment, AD users and groups. And by the way, Microsoft even says do not use this group. So please check to make sure that you're not using account operators, that there's no one in it. If there is, remove them. It's amazing how often this is what we find. AD admin accounts. These are accounts in domain admins, administrators, schema admins, enterprise admins, and the passwords are insanely old. 14.5 years for the default domain administrator account. That may not have changed or only changed once since the entire Active Directory environment has been around. I don't know about you, but my passwords from 10 years ago, they were awful. I guess they're better now. Default domain administrator account spin. So we've heard of Kerberoasting, I'm sure. This is a way to gather the spins, or I'm sorry, look up a spin for an account, pull a service ticket for Kerberos, and then take that offline and crack it, as long as it's in a format that we can do that with. But this is bad because this means that someone was running SQL with this account. I'm still amazed how often we find this. But it's also really bad when you have a regular user account. It's a person account, and they are a member of, say, domain admins, and they have a service principal name. And it's like, what was Thrawn doing? Well, he set up a SQL server. All right, well, what is he doing with that SQL server, and why is he using his own account as the service account? I don't know. Thrawn kind of does his own thing. Yes, Danny said, don't be Thrawn. Oh, sorry. The guy behind, what's your name? Okay, thank you, Thrawn. So, is Andrew in here? Andrew Schwartz, calling you out. Where are you? Andrew, come up here. Andrew didn't believe I was going to call him out on stage today. Don't be Andrew. So service accounts and domain admins, this is a big problem. What we want to do is we want to get these out of domain admins as much as we can. Domain admins have way too many rights. Full admin rights on every workstation, server, domain controller, AD itself, way too many rights. You don't need accounts and domain admins to do the things that they need to do. You can delegate these appropriate rights. If you have a vulnerability scanning account, please don't put it in domain admins. That is an awful, awful idea, regardless of what your vendor says. Have one service account for workstations, one for servers, and one for domain controllers. And if you can't do that, at least have a separate one for domain admins, which gets disabled when you're not scanning stuff. One of the things that really concerns me is when you have a scanning system or vulnerability scanning product, and you load in these very highly privileges into these systems. Of course, we all know that security software is very securely developed and written, right? How about server GPOs linked to domain controllers? This is not a great idea. Why? Because these settings that are in that group policy that applies to servers also apply to domain controllers. And what ends up happening is you have unintended consequences. Please split that out. You don't want someone to be able to modify that GPO that shouldn't. They're not a domain admin. And you don't want some weird thing to happen like adding server admins to your administrators group for Active Directory. Because what ends up happening is the server admins group owns AD now, as well as some servers. So we want to make sure that we limit the use of this, or at least not do it at all. And like I said, if you have the modifier rights to a GPO linked at the domain level or the DC level, that means this person here, Nick Fury, has the ability to install or run code on DCs, or reduce the level of security, or update group membership in Active Directory. Maybe you trust Nick. But we want to make sure only our AD admins can do that. And then there's a big problem with user rights assignments in group policy, which are rarely ever looked at. There's a lot of accounts in AD that get delegated rights. So through group membership, delegated permission, group policy delegation, and user rights assignment. So these two are bad, right? Server tier 3, especially if they're not domain admins. But the what's next to it is even worse. Why would domain users ever need to log on to a domain controller? Trust me, they don't. The other thing is when you have delegation at the domain level that ends up in configuring a situation where, say, all your computers in your domain have full control on objects. That's a bad idea. Or server admins have the ability to modify all computers in the entire domain through their permissions. And then there's this thing called admin SD holder, which applies permissions on the most privileged or highly privileged accounts and groups in Active Directory. So domain admins, administrators, enterprise admins, schema admins, etc. Do not do delegation at the admin SD holder unless you are very careful and you know exactly what your goal is and what the result's going to be. Because once you set the permissions here, 60 minutes later, it's going to apply to your admins. And so there's a few links here on how to review your AD permissions. PowerShell script, there's an AC Lite batch file that calls PowerShell. It's using the same function basically as BloodHound. And as I talked about last year, we need to get away from our AD admins using regular workstations for administration. We've got to stop doing this. It's too dangerous because one workstation has 30 accounts in the local administrators group, 50 accounts with local admin via software that's managing that, 20 accounts with control of the computer via security agents that can install and run code. So there's about 100 accounts that ends up with effective rights on workstations. This is not uncommon. We see this a lot. And then how many GPOs apply to these workstations? How many accounts have modifier rights to those GPOs? Ultimately, who has control of those workstations? This is a very clear path to compromise of your Active Directory environment. And then Kerberos delegation is a weird thing. It's basically impersonation. And there's been a number of talks, certainly this weekend and in the past, about Kerberos delegation, which I'm glad to see the highlight of delegation. It is impersonation. It's a trusted way to say, this account has the ability to impersonate users, and watch what they can do. But I just want to talk about unconstrained for a minute. Unconstrained came out in Active Directory. And we need to switch that over to constrained because unconstrained has access to everything. It's tough to go from unconstrained to constrained because you need to know what those services are that it needs to be able to impersonate and connect to. And if you have delegation in your environment, make sure all your admin accounts have this box checked. If they're unable to manage SharePoint or something like that, then uncheck the box for those accounts. Also add your Active Directory admin accounts to protected users. The other thing I talked about last year was cross-forest administration. So Forest B trusts users in Forest A. This domain admin account in Forest A has to administer both of them. So commonly, they go ahead and have their domain admin account that's in Forest A in the Forest B admins group because that makes it easier. And Microsoft says it's okay to have a one-way trust because that's safe and it's not going to be a problem. The issue is that if Forest B is a lower level or a forest with a lower security posture, like a DMZ, and that gets compromised, the credentials for this Forest A domain admin account is on Forest B's DCs. And that means that gets compromised, which means Forest A gets compromised. So you want to be very careful with cross-forest administration. Better is to make sure that we create a new account or use an account in Forest B for Forest B administration, or create a new account in Forest A. It's just a regular user in Forest A. We want to isolate and protect that and make sure that we're not in a situation where compromise of one compromises the other. So let's talk about some fun stuff. Very rarely do domain controllers have encrypted storage. This provides some very interesting scenarios for attackers. So we could talk about backups or the IFM, which is an install from media. So Active Directory admins, when they're spinning up a new domain controller, will create an IFM set using NTDS util. This means that the domain controller that you're promoting doesn't have to pull down and replicate all the data. So create the IFM set, put it on that server you're about to promote or will promote in the future. But that server's not well protected. This IFM file set is there. Or, as I've heard, this may have been put in sysvol before. Really bad idea. So, using the DS internals tools, we can interact and pull the hashes directly out of the IFM set. Why? Because it's everything you need in order to get the access to that data. The encryption key is in the registry hive, which we pull from IFM, and then we can just go ahead and pull that data directly out of it. Put it in hashcat format, crack it, reuse it, what have you. So let's talk about some really interesting things you could do with this. We can check the primary group ID on an account. So here we have Baba Fett. Baba Fett has a primary group ID is 513. That's domain users. That's what everyone should have. But let's stop the AD service on our domain controller and change this to 512. Anyone know what 512 is, the RID? Domain admins. So if we change this to 512, we're basically adding this domain admins without modifying the membership of domain admins. And we're going to start the service again. Why is this interesting? Well, one, we've stopped the AD service, so there's no security auditing of this change. So we can do this on the DC that's running if we get access to the DC, or if the DC is turned off for maintenance or is rebooting, we can interrupt that. And then we can interact with the DIT directly on the storage. Or think of a situation where an attacker compromises your VMware environment and then basically stops your domain controller for running, connects into the storage, and modifies the DIT in the storage there. It can do something like this. So let's take this one more step. Well, we can change the primary group ID. There it is. Now it's domain admins. So this will obviously, when the DC comes back up, it'll replicate. That means that if the attacker has access to this account, they're going to have some very interesting persistence for a while. We can do something similar with SID history. There's no SID history here. Same thing. We're going to stop AD, modify the DIT, start AD again. Again, it doesn't matter if we do this on a running DC by stopping the AD service, or if we modify the DIT directly on storage. When we get the the DC back up again and running. It replicates. Now we have this account that has SID history. But it gets more interesting than that. Now, all of this is using DS internals, and all of this is based on a presentation that Michael Grafner did at the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference in November of last year. There's this switch that he added to DS internals called skip meta update. This is very interesting. So let's talk about this switch. What we're going to do is get some account properties, some SIDs from the environment. We're going to get some user information about Django Fett. This is our new persistence account. Then what we're going to do is we're going to stop AD. Again, same scenario as I said before. We're an attacker. We're on DC for 5 minutes. We're going to stop the AD service, or again, we can modify the DIT directly. And we're going to use this new switch, skip meta update. And we're going to update what I just talked about, SID history, primary group ID for this account. Well, after this comes back up again, I just want to note we've done that on 22. When that comes back up again, it's up and running for a while. Let's go ahead and check those properties. There's been no change to Django Fett at all. So we check our DCs. We take a look at everything. Well, what about DC22? We take a look at DC22. The change stays on that DC. All of your security tooling today is looking at DCs in your data center. We now have to broaden that. We have to think bigger. We have to do better analysis of our AD environment to check for this sort of compromise. AD admins rarely are monitoring when there's a situation where a DC shuts down randomly and then comes back up again. We often don't think about our VMware admins as being domain admins. It's important to do so because most domain controllers are now virtual. Keep in mind that access to this storage that the DC has means AD modification. And there's no auditing of these changes. So how do you detect this? Not really. Not exactly. We can monitor for NTDS service stop-start events. So that'd be a good way to look for someone actually doing something weird. Certainly the AD admins should communicate, and if security sees the AD service stop, they should reach out and be like, what's going on with this DC? Is everything okay? And the AD admin is like, chill out. I just had to change this and then restart it. It's like, okay. But we might be able to replicate, monitor for replication to see when ADC is offline and then comes back up if it's doing some replication all of a sudden. Now, this may be something that the system crashed and it had some changes it still needed to replicate, but it's something that might be interesting. So if we see a scenario where the AD service stops and then restarts, in this situation, it only took 10 seconds. So in 10 seconds, someone can modify your domain controller and have persistence forever on that DC. So in my Django Fett scenario, I made that modification on 22. That may be a branch office DC way out somewhere. Django Fett is a user everywhere, except when he connects to DC 22. So we know Active Directory Recon is a big deal. BloodHound is out there. PowerView is out there. It gives us good insight into what's going on in AD, how things are configured. Attackers use it too. So there's a auditing configuration you can set on DCs called object access. It's usually not enabled because it can be pretty noisy. It's 4662. It's just generic. You have to then configure the objects you want some auditing on. So we can detect AD recon activity with this auditing. We can actually configure the SACLs or the auditing settings on our admin SD holder object. And whenever someone reads something from that object, it's going to get logged and audited. Because what ends up happening is from the admin SD holder, as I said earlier, about 60 minutes later, it's going to update it on the objects that are protected by the admin SD prop, which is a process that checks the admin SD holder and stamps those permissions on those objects. So when we run something like PowerView to look at our domain admins group, we're going to see who did it, and we're going to see what they were looking at. So we can do the same thing, not just for our privilege groups, which are pretty much automatic when we set it on admin SD holder, but we want to set that on other custom groups as well. That might be interesting. And these auditing settings are pretty much here. They're pretty easy to figure out. So we want to set it for everyone. That's anyone that's connecting and looking. This object only, or you could set it to this object and all descendants, depending on what your use case is. Basically, read all properties for permissions and properties. That way you can see everything, see what's being looked at. So like I said, we can set it on the admin SD holder, set it on custom privilege groups. Now, we can also audit for things beyond recon with this technique. We can look at GPO modifications. So when someone's changing a GPO, they modify it or they delete it, or they change something with the GPO like the display name, we can set auditing on that. And again, it's a 4662. By the way, I'm not talking about anything new here. This has been around since the early days of Active Directory. But it's interesting because it's almost never talked about, almost never configured in environments, because it can be noisy. There can be a lot of events that get logged. So GPO sysvol auditing, again, this is a new event though, 4663, because GPOs are set up as the AD component and the file component in sysvol. The AD component is where you actually create the GPO, set up some of the things, but the actual settings are stored in the file in sysvol. So we need to do a little bit more work to set that configuration. We have to enable it through the GPO and then configure it on sysvol. I talked about something similar a while back when you want to audit for someone looking for group policy preference passwords. So you could configure a GPO and basically set it so that no one would ever look at it, because you just set the folder in there for a GPO that doesn't really exist. And anyone that's scanning sysvol looking for stuff would see it. You would see that. Same thing if you have laps. You can do the same thing. There's a PowerShell commandlet for it in the laps module, where you can configure auditing of who accesses the password attribute. Wow, it's quiet in here. One of the things you must be doing today, hopefully, and you were doing this yesterday, is monitoring for event log clearing. Event ID 1102. This should be your #1 event to be monitored in your environment. There's rarely a good reason to clear the event log. Attackers love clearing event logs. Okay, that's interesting, but what else can we do? We can break AD recon. We can change the permissions for authenticated users, which by default have the ability to look at everything. We can go in and basically look to see where authenticated users has rights. And of course, they're able to look at everything so they can enumerate domain admins. So we can lock this down, and we can set a configuration where, first of all, we remove this pre-Windows 2000 compatible access, because hopefully no one has any NT running in their environment. So we're going to remove authenticated users out of this, because this has some default permissions on some objects. Then what we're going to do is we are going to have an OU, a root level OU called AD management. And we're going to make some changes to that so authenticated users cannot see inside of it. So when users go to look at it, they see that there's an object there, but they can't see anything inside of it. And what gets really interesting is that when we put our domain admins group inside of this, PowerView says there are no domain admins. But if we look at our administrator account, for example, we can see that it's a member of domain admins through the member of attribute, because there's what's called a backlink in Active Directory. So we can configure a secure admin OU with special permissions. We're going to put all of our privileged admin accounts and groups in this OU. And the object is there, but you can't see inside of it. And we always recommend that when you lock things down that you add a view group, so that way it can be audited. If you have GPOs that you're removing authenticated users from, which is a good idea for some security settings, you want to make sure there's a group that can still see it. So that way when your security team or a security team needs to look at it, or you have auditors come in to look at settings, configurations, it's easy to do. You have a group for that. But what if we could just get rid of that entirely? What if we could hide the whole thing? What if we could cloak the ship? That would be pretty cool. So in AD, there's this thing called List Object Access Mode. Again, this has been around for a while. It adds this new permission option called List Object and controls the visibility on these AD objects. And we do this through what's called DS heuristics. DS heuristics is a single attribute in Active Directory that enables you to modify the way AD actually works and does things. And actually, in fact, a lot of colleges use this in order to hide groups and group membership from other students so they can't see who's in the class. So this has been around for a while and used. Again, we're going to remove authenticated users from pre-Windows 2000 compatible. we are going to go in and modify our DS heuristics from not set to 1. Once we do that, we have this new checkbox called list object. So what we're going to do is on our root of our domain, because we're feeling a little crazy today, it's Sunday, everyone's asleep, no one will notice. So we move authenticated users from the domain. And what ends up happening is for all authenticated users, all of these OUs disappear. Cloak of invisibility. They're gone. Now, domain admins can still see them. We can configure the permissions on the domain root. So again, a view-only group can see it. But it hasn't really changed anything from a recon perspective. We can still see our domain admins. So what do we need to do? Well, let's kick authenticated users out of being able to see domain admins. It's going to work for like 60 minutes, and then admin SD holder is going to restamp that. So we modify the admin SD holder in order to make sure that it's removed from there. And then what happens? There are no admins. They're gone. And we can't even look inside of an OU in this. So let's run BloodHound and see what happens. We run BloodHound. So we run SharpHound. I like the PowerShell thing because I like PowerShell. So it goes through, and what do you think is going to be in this JSON file? Yeah, domain admin membership. BloodHound is looking at multiple attributes in Active Directory, not just the group membership, but also the accounts themselves and their member of attribute, that backlink. So let's break that. Feel like breaking stuff today? So what we're going to do is we're going to move all of our 80 admins into this secured OU, including our domain admins group. Now we run BloodHound again, and what happens? There is no domain admins group in the BloodHound group's JSON file. Couldn't see it. So this means that we can do some breaking here. And let's talk some more about breaking BloodHound Recon. And again, BloodHound can be a very good tool for blue teamers. So what we want to do is provide access to the blue team and our security testing team to make sure that they can get the data they need in order to test the security and look at things in their environment. So I've talked about breaking the admin group and account enumeration. Local administrators group membership. So in Windows 10, 15.07 and newer, only local admins can do that enumeration. So that's kind of fixed by default once you deploy Windows 10, any modern current version of Windows 10. But if you don't have Windows 10, you definitely want to enable the host-based firewall because BloodHound is going to reach out to all your workstations and get the local group, enumerate the local group local administrators group membership. And it can do that because there's this old NT function that just says, yeah, anyone wants to know this, go ahead. But when you use computer management, you connect to that system and it's like, sorry, you can't see administrators. Like, all right, I'll just use this old method instead, which is what BloodHound takes advantage of, which is what most recon systems take advantage of. Here's a tip. You can also have the firewall there, have it set not to block anything, just in audit mode, so you can get a good idea of what's happening, what's connecting to it. You can pull that into your SIM, or you can pull that into a central logging system like WEF and get some insight into that. And net session enumeration is interesting and become, again, more popular because of BloodHound, because it allows you to say, hey, computer, what accounts are connected to you right now? Oh, and by the way, what computers are they coming from? And Windows is like, sure, here you go. That seems like important stuff for you to have, random user on my network. But we can turn that off. We can break that with a tool called NetSeize by the Microsoft research team. And it removes authenticated users so they can't do this. We can do this on DCs. We can do it on file servers. Guess what? BloodHound now cannot do net session enumeration in the environment because the stealth mode, as I understand it, basically switches from connecting to DCs for this and then connecting to the servers, the file servers, home directory servers. And then the GPO security permissions, again, if you can't see it, you can't enumerate the permissions, you can't enumerate the settings. So there's some really interesting things we can do with Active Directory. Again, always test before deploy. Don't say, hey, Sean said that we can go ahead and do this, we can cloak our AD and no one will be able to see it and it'll be awesome. Okay, hold on. You can totally cloak your AD and make it invisible and it's awesome, but you absolutely need to test it and make sure that it's not going to break stuff first. One good way to do this is to make sure that you set up auditing on these administrative groups so that you know who is connecting to them. So one of the things that I've recommended for customers in the past, and I set this up in a pretty large environment many years ago, is this concept of a secure admin OU for Active Directory administrators. And what's great about this is you have a root level OU that no one can modify except for your AD admins. Make sure there's no group policies that apply to it except the one specific for that. You put your AD admins in there. You put your AD admin workstations in there, AD admin servers in there. You can put your AD admin groups in there and control who can see them, who can have access to them, who can interact with them. So, can Active Directory be secured? Absolutely. We help with that all the time. But more importantly, your team can do that as well. I was sitting in the speaker room just before, probably about an hour ago, and I was updating slides with my fun little Derbycon memories thing. And someone said, "What's your talk about?" I said, "Oh, it's Active Directory." He goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." I go, "Oh, interesting. I'm sorry. Okay, tell me more." So he was like, "Well, I guess it's good if you're an attacker or a red teamer. A lot of organizations find it helpful too." I said, "What do you do?" So, Linux system admin. "Oh, cool. How do you manage those?" Let's just say it was a little awkward. And then I changed the subject and like, how's your Derbycon going? And he's like, "Yeah, it's the last year." I'm like, "Wow, man. It's like that old SNL skit. Wah, 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 wah." Jeez, okay. Have you had a good time? Yeah, absolutely. It was good. But that's the thing that we run into, especially when we're AD admins. We work with AD, we're AD engineers. It's tough. It's tough to fix these things. It's tough to get these things handled. But we can configure a secure environment. We can configure things where we can see what's going on. We can know what's going on in our environment. We want to make sure that we do some sort of tiering, that we isolate our Active Directory admins or domain admins. So here's the thing. Domain admins only get their rights through the domain administrators group. The domain administrators group is the one that has Active Directory admin rights and has DC admin rights. So if we can isolate and protect all of these groups that have the most privileged access in our environment, then we can be in good shape. At least not to the point where someone's on our DCs. But again, we have to make sure that our Active Directory databases are protected when it's running on the DC as well as when it's not. We have encrypted VMs now on all the major platforms. There's some encryption options in the cloud as well. But admin workstations are now a requirement. I know that is really tough to implement and to work and to use, but we have to do that. So let's talk about levels of getting where we need to go. So level 1, securing Active Directory, make sure our local admin passwords change. Like, easy button of doing this, Microsoft Labs. Let's just get it done. We want to minimize our groups and users with domain admin and logon rights. So no more domain users that can log on to our domain controllers, please. I mean, I understand that the admin is going on vacation or something. Just in case something happens, we want someone to be able to get on the DC. Make sure that just like we have been talking about for years, a separate user account and a separate admin account, we also have a separate AD admin account if that person is in multiple roles. Just like we separated a user account and an admin account, we want to make sure that we isolate our DCs and have them on some sort of admin workstation or server. And sensitive and cannot be delegated will protect against these Kerberos delegation attacks a lot of the time. Service accounts absolutely need long, complex passwords. And one of the best things you can do is set a GPO in your environment so these highly privileged groups and accounts can't just log on to workstations. Service accounts, group managed service accounts. You can set these up and configure these on most systems. AD will manage the password for you automatically, free out of the box. And fine-grained password policies, starting with 2008, will enable you to set password policies specific to Active Directory admins and service accounts. Make those longer, make them more complex, Force them to use better passwords. Because if your password policy for your domain is, what, 7 characters? Guess what people may use for the service accounts? That's not great. We want to get rid of NTLM v1. NTLM v1 is a very bad protocol. It uses MD5 for encryption, and at the time it was like, this is great. We can use MD5. This is awesome. No, not really. We know that. It's hard to get rid of it. But we can set up auditing on DCs and servers to see what's using what version of NTLM. And we definitely don't want any Active Directory admin or domain admin accounts in, or at least logging on to systems that aren't DCs. Scenario I talk about a lot with this is, let's say you have a vulnerability scanning account, and it's in DA. Common scenario, right? Doesn't matter what the product is. Most of them, people end up taking the service account, putting it in domain admins. So this account will scan all your systems, right? Well, unconstrained delegation is a way for that system to impersonate a user, including a service account that's a vulnerability scanning account. It can impersonate anyone. Or let's say that that security service is scanning everything and it hiccups because the developer forgot to add a comma or close a bracket or something. And that credential gets sprayed across your entire environment. What's the tabletop exercise for that? What's the solution to that? Now you have your service account credentials that's in domain admins on every system in your organization. Well, maybe that makes things easier. I don't know. For who, though? And one of the things we also talk about is limiting management protocol access on domain controllers to admin subnets. So RDP, WMI, WinRM, not everyone on the network needs to be able to use these. Again, make sure that your auditors, make sure that the assessors can connect to these when they need to. Level 3, complete separation of administration. So this is where any service account, any account that's a member of an Active Directory admin group does not log on anywhere except a domain controller or doesn't connect to anything like that. Time-based temporal group and membership. It's a little hard to do, but you basically want to make sure that if the account is compromised, it's not a member of a privileged group. So it has to wait. So protecting admin creds, I have a single slide for this so that you have some information all on one page. We want to make sure that, again, AD admins are logging on to something separate. And there's some additional mitigations. I mentioned NTLM auditing. You can also do SMB auditing. Get rid of SMB v1. It's bad. Please change your Curb TDG account password. Why? I talked about backups. Regularly, we find that the Curb TDG password hasn't changed in 10 years or 15 years since the AD environment was created. And because it hasn't changed since it was created, if an attacker got access to a backup file from 13 years ago that someone misplaced, your entire Active Directory environment can get compromised. So we want to make sure that we do the right things. We have our admins change their passwords. We change our Curb TDG, especially if someone leaves. And then there's a tool called Ping Castle written by Vincent. Vincent in here? Thought I saw him. There he is. He's over there. Vincent, I always mispronounce your name. Say your last name. Letou. Vincent Letou. I hope I said that right. So Vincent wrote Ping Castle. It's an awesome tool. There's a free version of it and an enterprise version which has additional features that you can pay for. But there's a free version. Check it out, download it, run it, see the visualizations. It will help you figure out some of the issues in your environment very quickly and easily. So in summary, fix the easy stuff, please. Stuff I talk about here we see all the time. I don't want to see these anymore. I want to work on the hard stuff. You bring Trimark in, make us work. But and attackers and red teamers, make them work too. We want to do that. But we can remove these auth users and change the way that the permissions are. Flip the permission model on its head. We can change it. We want to test first, audit first, get the data first, then go to block. Make sure our DC storage is encrypted. And please monitor DC reboots and potential for modifying the DIT. It's been my time. Thank you very much for yours. Love you, Derbycon. Out in the hallway if you have questions.